History isn't always as brightly lit and straightforward as we hope. As time passes, and at the most unexpected of times, the most impressive solutions to mysteries emerge. Number 10. The scene was set in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, back in 1962. It was here that Audrey Jean Backberg was living with her partner of 5 years and their 2 children. Although to outsiders, Audrey's life seemed picture perfect, cruelty lurked within. That year, on the 4th of July, the 20-year-old would file a complaint against her husband, the man who had allegedly threatened to take her life. In fact, he loaded 2 firearms and shoved them into the trunk of his car. It isn't known what became of that complaint, but 3 days later, Audrey mysteriously disappeared. On the 7th of July, she was headed to a local woolen mill where she worked to pick up her paycheck. Accompanying her was a hired babysitter, who was also an acquaintance. Leaving her husband and young children behind, Audrey and the babysitter allegedly got into a Greyhound bus bound for Indiana. Not long after, the young nanny arrived at the police station and turned herself in as a runaway. She claimed that the two had hitchhiked to Madison, where they would then hop onto the Greyhound bus. She'd last seen her employer walking around the corner, away from the bus stop. Audrey had vanished. Despite the story from the sitter, some believed that something more sinister was at play here, but with no evidence to support the idea, the case went cold. The missing person report was stacked up with the rest of the Sauk County Sheriff's Office, waiting for the modern era where podcasters and YouTubers could bring it back into the light. Often, the same conclusion would arise through the knowledge of the complaint that Audrey had filed just 3 days before her disappearance. Many point the finger at the unnamed husband, suggesting he was behind it all. That accusation, though, was unsupported by the sitter, who accompanied the missing woman that day. The lack of evidence and reports on police investigations didn't lead to any breakthroughs either. So it seemed that even in the technological era, with renewed efforts and fresh appeals, the case was still a bust. Audrey would now be in her 80s, still classified as endangered and missing. But then, most unexpectedly, there was a revelation. Through some diligent investigative efforts, the police would uncover some new insights, ones that would lead them down a bizarre yet understandable route. When this much time has passed, all hope having dwindled, most would expect to find the remains of the missing. But in the case of Audrey Backberg, police were led to the doorstep of the very much alive 82-year-old. It turned out that she had willingly departed from Reedsburg and relocated just outside of Wisconsin. No criminal activity or foul play was involved. According to lead detectives in the case, Audrey's uncomfortable situation with her husband may have played a role in her decision, which is one that she's happy and confident in. She told them she has no regrets of leaving her old life behind. Number 9. Steve Wick, a writer, was working on a book about the last farmers of North Fork when he heard the story of the haunting disappearance. While he hadn't paid much attention to the story at the time, it was certainly one that he wouldn't forget. Sometime later, Wick would leave Newsday and become the executive editor of the Suffolk Times. He would also become a Riverhead News Review and Shelter Island reporter. On his very first day there, Wick recalled the strange story he had heard all those years prior. That missing person now had a name. It was Louise Petrevich. Louise's story begins back in October of 1966. While married to a prominent farmer, she was also seeing a local police officer named William P. Boken. It turned out that both of these men were allegedly cruel towards the then 38-year-old. These powerful men, of course, were being protected by other powerful men. Louise was living in New York when the strange series of events began to unfold. It all began on the 5th of October when she headed to the bank to withdraw the large sum of $1,273, which came from her personal bank account. Oddly, she then closed that account. The next day, Louise would take her young daughter to the school bus stop and drop her off there. This would be the last memory that Sandy would have of her mother, because not long after that, she would vanish. Louise's disappearance was something that the whole town knew about, but her name wouldn't make it to the headlines at the time. For 3 days leading up to the disappearance, Officer Boken had called in sick to work. Then on the 6th, he resigned. These strange acts certainly painted a guilty picture, but with no evidence and no sign of Louise anywhere, the case would ultimately go cold. Then, 52 years later, something extraordinary happened. The case had long been forgotten, and no new inquests were being made. Nevertheless, the police received a tip in 2018, and it came from an unexpected source. The random tip allegedly came from Boken's ex-wife, who made the claim that there was a body buried in the basement of the Southold home, the very home that was formerly occupied by the officer. Police rushed to the scene with advanced radar equipment that they would use to scour the dirt floor in the colonial-era house. They had a hit. Buried 7 feet beneath the floor, under a 5-inch thick concrete slab, was a skeleton. DNA testing would reveal that those remains belonged to the missing woman, Louise Petrevich, whose vanishing now seemed to be under suspicious circumstances. The writer, Steve Wick, was so disturbed by this story that he continued to investigate it with the aid of content director Grant Parpin. Together, they began knocking on doors in search of documents, including property and employment records. It was through these efforts that they began to put the pieces of the puzzle together and uncovered some sinister things lurking in the darkness following the unforeseen vanishing. It turned out that Boken was considered a suspect in the disappearance. 2 state police investigators had named him as such, but their case would hit a wall when the judge claimed that the officer was mentally ill. Boken himself would then vanish, only to turn up again some 20 years later in Queens. In 2018, following the renewed interest in the case, investigators would re-interview Judith Terry, who had married Boken back in '66, the same year of the disappearance. She told police that twice over the last 5 decades her husband had threatened her, stating that if she kept it up, she would end up in the basement too, along with the other women. Judith even claimed to have seen Boken burying a burlap-wrapped body in the basement. Now, Louise's name is finally making it to the headlines, but as the woman who became the homicide victim of a town cop. Number 8. The Medinet Habu inscriptions first described the concept of the mysterious Sea People. It was during the Bronze Age that these enigmatic people came from the ocean, breaching the land of ancient societies, attacking and conquering them. For those societies, the arrival of these unknown beings sparked terror and fear. By uniquely designed ships, the Sea People arrived in Syria, Palestine, Cyprus, Egypt, and Anatolia, destroying everything in their path. Frantic cries for help emanated from these regions. One such letter echoed its way into the kingdom of Cyprus. It spoke of enemy ships and the arrival of the Sea People, who were inflicting great damage upon them. This message would be a foreshadowing for Cyprus, which had yet to be attacked by the mysterious group of seafarers. Only it wouldn't make its way to its intended destination. Cyprus received no warning of the pending kingdom collapse. The Sea People, an aggressive band of mariners, staged large assaults on the thriving cities of the era. They'd come from the waters, bringing destruction, demise, and piracy along with them. Then, once they had taken as many lives and as much loot as possible, they would retreat and vanish into the sea. Stories of the barbaric invaders survived the times, only to land in the hands of modern-day historians. Some spoke of horned helmets, bird-shaped ships, and varying types of attire. With these haunting stories and sinister descriptions, questions about the mysterious seafarers abound. Who were they? Where did they come from? Where did they go? For centuries, these questions would go unanswered, even well into the modern era. The Sea People hadn't disappeared into the waters, but instead boarded their boats and made their way back to their homes, leaving the inscribed stories as the only piece of evidence used to identify them. Since the seafarers left no trace behind, archaeologists were forced to rely on notes made by the Egyptian, Canaanite, and Hittite people. Notes such as the 3,200-year-old inscription carved into a limestone slab found in modern-day Turkey. While the piece was found in the late 1800s, it wouldn't be until 2017 that the ancient Luwian language would finally be deciphered. The ancient symbols spoke of the Sea People, giving insight into who they were. The script tells the story of a united fleet of kingdoms from Western Asia Minor. The inscription suggests that Mira, along with several other Anatolian states, had banded together and invaded Egypt and other regions of the Mediterranean, contributing to the fall of the era. The deciphering of this text and the discovery of Asia Minor civilizations being involved in the marauding fleet can finally set historians on the path to solving the ancient Mediterranean puzzle. Supporting this idea was another relief found on the mortuary temple of Ramses III. Its relief suggests a chaotic battle between Egyptian archers and a spear-wielding army. The scene is said to recount an invasion by the Sea People. An accompanying inscription further adds plausibility and ultimately a solution. It claims that the seaborne enemies were an alliance of tribes. These separate societies all stemmed from places like Anatolia and surrounding areas, including Sardinia, Sicily, and Cyprus. Several of the people were also of Eastern Mediterranean origin, suggesting that the mysterious people weren't one civilization, but many. When the need for greener pastures presented itself, these distinct groups would become unsettled and begin their search for new land. They would end up with captives, hostages, and prisoners who would quickly adapt to their ways, leading the Egyptians and other victims to the understanding of a united army. The Sea Peoples were a collective group of civilizations from various origins who raided, terrorized, and overtook many kingdoms, leading to the mysterious stories of seaborne armies. Number 7. In the 1st century, the Roman writer Pliny began to describe a curious artifact. The stones were called Ceraunia. He believed that the objects had been made in the sky by the gods who had thrown them to the earth. Pliny suggested that the stones were sought after by the Magi of the Zoroastrian religion. Their explanation for these objects seemed likely, since they'd suddenly appeared where the lightning would strike. The ancient people began to believe that these oddities provided them with protection, specifically against lightning. They gathered these objects and placed them in their homes to ward off nightmares and witchcraft. In Scandinavia, they were used to protect against trolls. The belief that these strange objects were the remnants of lightning was so widespread that records of it can be found all over Europe and even Africa. Stories of the Ceraunia continued to drift through the times and re-emerged in the 16th century. It was that century that inhabitants across the globe would see something strange beginning to unfold before their very eyes. By now, the concept of the stones being protective artifacts began to dwindle, and they weren't being used in homes as much as they had been before. So, with many of these stones having been discarded by the ancient people, they began to pop up in crop fields and gardens. There were strange, pointy stones that were making a sudden, eerie appearance, and our ancestors had no idea what they were. In an effort to explain the arrival of these sharp, mysterious objects, they arrived at the story of the Thundersstones, a concept similar to the one described by Pliny. They believed that these artifacts had come from the sky and were thrown to the earth by the gods who were fighting in the sky, which is the explanation used to understand thunderstorms. The concept of the artifact being natural stone formed in the storm clouds became widespread. They'd fallen with the lightning. Christians hadn't challenged the idea either and agreed with the battles of heaven as much as any other religion. It wouldn't be until the later 16th century that the concept of a natural phenomenon was finally brought into question. In 1580, a Vatican City official named Michele Mercati, the man who essentially invented archaeology, laid eyes upon one such artifact. He had a fondness for unusual curiosities and examining exotic objects. The opportunity had presented itself when the Byzantine emperor had sent a thunderstone to the Pope for good luck. Mercati came to investigate the object. The official declared that the objects had not come from the heavens, and instead suggested something controversial. He believed that the stones were actually the arrowheads and axe heads of tools created by the people of the Stone Age. Of course, no one believed him and considered him to be a maniac. So our ancestors continued collecting these so-called heavenly stones, unaware of just how right Mercati was. The mysterious Thunderstone story persisted until the 20th century, when modern-day archaeologists and scientists corroborated Mercati's claims. The enigmatic artifacts were, in fact, Stone Age-era tools discarded by prehistoric people, only to emerge centuries later. Number 6. It was 1963, the height of the Cold War, when something strange was underway. It was 7:45 on the morning of the 1st of January, when two boys began combing the banks of the Lane Cove River, situated in Chatswood, Sydney, in search of their golf balls. But what they would find instead would become one of the most chilling homicide mysteries in history. As the boys continued to comb the river, they happened upon the body of a man lying face down on the narrow dirt track. Initially, they thought he was intoxicated from the previous night's revelries, but an hour later, when they found him in the same spot, they decided to investigate. As they neared the unmoving body, they would find that the man was no longer alive. Vital fluid trickled from his nose, and a purple patch stained his face. Police arrived at the scene to discover that the deceased man was Dr. Gilbert Bogle, and he wasn't the only body there that day. Just 20 yards away, another startling discovery would be made. Under a few sheets of cardboard lay the body of a woman. This was Mrs. Margaret Chandler, who also held no signs of violence. But investigators would arrive at the harrowing conclusion that they were poisoned. Given the state that the two individuals were found in, police arrived at the conclusion that they must have been lovers, and so theories began to spew out. Although the area was known as Lover's Lane, the track was not the best spot for a romantic exchange. It was dirty and unpleasant, but the car was left in good condition, so it didn't seem as though they were forced to go there. Yet there must have been another person present after the fact, since both the bodies had been covered. Police pursued all leads and turned to the public for help, but came up empty-handed. What they did manage to put together, though, was the previous night's endeavors. On New Year's Eve, Dr. Bogle and the Chandlers headed to the party at the home of a Cicero colleague. Bogle had been the life of the party, and it became increasingly obvious that he and Chandler seemed interested in one another. Around 11:30 that evening, Bogle would leave the home in search of an open shop to purchase some cigarettes. As he searched, he went back to travel deeper into the city of Balmain, where Chandler's husband had secretly met up with Pam Logan. The Chandlers, though, both knew of the other's interests and seemed to have been enjoying an open relationship. The following day, in the early morning hours, Mr. Chandler left his wife and took Mr. Bogle home, leaving Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler to their devices. Mr. Chandler would later be awoken by police, who came bearing grim news. From there, the case went cold, with no evidence pointing to any potential suspects. Some suggested a jealous wife or a homicidal maniac on the loose, but it seemed that the explanation was somewhat simpler, the culprit being the most unexpected and initially undetected. In the early 2000s, evidence of hydrogen sulfide in Lane Cove River had been discovered. Hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg gas, is highly poisonous and can claim lives in an instant. The toxic gas cloud came bubbling up from the river's mud that early morning, only to become trapped in the hollow where Bogle and Chandler lay, ultimately suffocating the couple. The pollution of the river stemmed from the dumping of industrial waste as well as sewage. Hydrogen sulfide in such high doses is fatal. Supporting the conclusion were the vital fluid samples taken from the victims, both of which had a bluish tinge to them. For decades, the question of who took the lives of Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler remained, only for the culprit to be revealed as a polluted river. Number 5. In the 1600s, the word dinosaur had yet to be invented. The concept of giant lizards having roamed the earth was not in circulation. In England, 2 centuries ago, everyone's main source of information was the Bible, which didn't hold any text about ancient giant lizards roaming the planet. So when the discovery of an obscure-shaped bone was made in 1676 in the Tainton Limestone Formation in Oxfordshire, no one knew what to make of it. It was a strange artifact, incomplete, and paired with the lack of scientific knowledge, it was the perfect recipe for a fantastical mystery. The fragment ended up in the hands of Robert Plott, a professor of chemistry at the University of Oxford. He was also the first curator of the Ashmolean Museum. A year after the artifact was discovered, Plott would place it in the museum and provide a published description of it, accompanied by a drawing. Society at this time had no evidence of the existence of dinosaurs, but they did have some peculiar beliefs and strange passed-down legends. So Plott concluded that the bone belonged to a Roman war elephant. Later, he would change this suggestion and represent it as the thigh bone of a giant, as so described in the Bible. England wasn't the only place to be finding some obscure artifacts for which they had no other evidence, leading to wild claims and conclusions. The ancient Greeks thought that they were the remains of Amazon warriors, and in Mongolia, fossils inspired the legend of a griffin, so the Tainton limestone bone lay in the museum, suggesting evidence of the existence of giants in England. In 1763, though, the bone became the center of much interest again, this time by Richard Brooks. He suggested that the artifact was more consistent with human anatomy. It was another misinterpretation that highlighted the challenges of early paleontology. The fragment would become the point of discussion again in 1824, when Oxford genealogy lecturer William Buckland rediscovered it. This time, he was armed with more fragments and was able to piece together something extraordinary. Through trial and error, Buckland managed to form an almost complete fossil, along with the jawbone, and named it Megalosaurus, an ancient giant lizard. Unknowingly, Buckland would put paleontology on the map, and was the first to describe what we now consider the dinosaur, a term that wouldn't be coined until another 18 years later. Still, this wasn't the end of the Tainton limestone bones saga. Years later, modern-day historians would discover the works of these early paleontologists, and would arrive at the conclusion that the mysterious object was part of the femur of a long-extinct dinosaur, as so suggested by Buckland. Number 4. Back in 1806, a strange, eerie mystery swept across Yorkshire. A hen, owned by Mary Bateman, was laying some prophetic eggs. The eggs bore strange messages, signaling the end times. One of the messages claimed the coming of Christ. It was an ominous inscription that Yorkshire, being in a time of unease, took to heart. The fortune-telling hen allowed Mary to revel in fame and money, since many residents would take up the magical services that she allegedly offered. For some time, the inscribed eggs would continue to be produced, instilling a sense of foreboding in the townspeople, and allowing Mary to flourish financially. But when the hen was taken away and mysteriously stopped laying the prophetic eggs, the enigma was finally uncovered. It turned out that the chicken, now named the Prophet Hen of Leeds, hadn't been laying such an ominous message, and it was all an incredible hoax that tricked the people into believing that the end of the world was fast approaching. Mary was a woman and self-proclaimed witch, born in Asenby, North Yorkshire. She received a good education and was able to read and write, but later in life, Mary turned to the unfortunate life of crime, committing a robbery that would send her fleeing from the town. In fact, it appeared as though she had a pathological need to steal, and was caught in the act several times. Alongside her affinity for stealing, she also had her spiritual side hustle as a fortune teller and a witch who would remove harmful spells that were cast upon her clients. Much like anyone of the time, Mary would keep chickens, giving her a steady supply of fresh eggs. So in 1806, desperate to make more money, she conjured up a dubious plan and sparked an intriguing mystery among the residents. Huge numbers of people lined up, pennies in hand, to get a view of the mystical eggs and the magic hen who was laying them. As soon as they witnessed it, she would whip into a frenzy, seemingly convinced of the impending doom that would be brought upon them. One day, though, skeptics would uncover the truth about Mary and her prophetic hen. They got up bright and early to observe the witch. They witnessed the chicken laying her eggs, only to have Mary come in and inscribe them with a corrosive ink, the very inscriptions that had Leeds in such a stir. Number 3. Patagonia, the land of the giants, is a place steeped in legends, intrigue, and mystery. It was here that the first stories of giant beings would emerge. It began in the 16th century when the first European explorers set foot on the land. One such explorer was Ferdinand Magellan, who would lead a voyage across the globe and finally to South America. It would be here that the group of explorers would come across something incredibly daunting: giants. The crew had encountered a tribe of indigenous people, who according to them were double the height of the average man. Antonio Pigafetta, a Venetian voyager, would embark on the same expedition along with Magellan and document the discovery. He stated that the large men had been dancing on the beach wearing animal skins as clothing. They towered at 9 feet and had bodies marked with various colored paints, including yellow circles around the eyes. In his report, Pigafetta claimed that Magellan had bestowed the name Patagonia upon the land, but his explanation abruptly ended there, leading many to speculate exactly what the word meant. It's suggested to mean big-footed, or possibly land of the big feet. Nonetheless, the name stuck, and from there on out it was seen as the land of the giants. In 1569, Francis Drake wrote of meeting a tribe of beings who towered above 7 feet. For the next 200 years, English and Dutch sailors and explorers would circulate rumors of such encounters. Some of them claimed to have engaged with tribes of 12-foot-tall giants, instilling fear in the community. In 1766, Commodore John Byron would return to London with the HMS Dolphin and his crew. They would boast the same story, except this time, the claims would see physical on-paper reports, allowing the legend to spread even further. For the first time, rumors of the giants had made it to print, appearing in the Gentleman's Magazine, then to newspapers, and then to journals. In Byron's version of events, though, they recalled the encounter of a tribe who measured 9 feet tall. Given the discrepancies in the stories of these travelers from the 1500s up to the 1700s, some began to grow skeptical. The mystery of the Patagonian giants remained at least for another 7 years. The legend became a scary bedtime story, a tale whispered around campfires, and a mystery among the communities. Then Byron's full account of the encounter was finally revealed. Much to everyone's disappointment, those 12-foot, 9-foot, and almost 8-foot tall Patagonian giants were no more than 6 foot 6 inches tall. This was still tall compared to the average European, but nowhere near as massive as the giants were rumored to be. They weren't legendary beasts after all, but rather just a tribe of tall people. The rumors, encounters, and reports were all lies and exaggerations that left many with chills running down their spines. Number 2. Contrasting against the backdrop of the Denizli province in Turkey is a curious building. It's the Plutonian at Hierapolis, or at least the ruins of it. The site is known as the Gate to Hell. It is a place of mystery that once fascinated the ancient Romans. It was here, in the ancient city of Hierapolis, that something strange had unfolded, something inexplicable to the ancient people. With such civilizations struggling to understand why something was happening, they would produce an elaborate story to explain it. Such was the case in the ominous ruins of the Gate to Hell, the entrance to the Plutonian, a shrine dedicated to Pluto, god of the underworld. With sacrificial animals in tow, Romans would venture to this alleged gate, believed to be a portal to the underworld. Without the use of a sharpened blade, priests would hold these animals toward the entrance, with one deep breath being the last. The ancient people believed this to be the breath of demise unleashed by Pluto. The priests were miraculously unharmed, leading to the illusion that supernatural forces were at play here. 2,000 years later, modern people would come across the site, where guardians of the Gate to Hell would be unearthed. The marble statues once served as an ominous warning. It warned of a fateful cave, a portal to the underworld, a dangerous site. Archaeological efforts would also unearth ancient texts that told the foreboding legends of underworld access. They claimed that mortals could access this realm from certain points of the earth, this Plutonian being one of them. With these strange writings, artifacts, and ruins emerging, archaeologists, historians, and scientists would find themselves tasked with unraveling the enduring mystery. And soon, the search for answers began. Swift experts discovered that the Gate to Hell had been built upon a highly geologically active area. In fact, the supposed portal had been built on top of a deep fault. Carbon dioxide seeped through the fissures, and a steady stream coated the site. In this quantity, though, the gas is relatively harmless, but billowing clouds of the poisonous gas could quickly suffocate any creature. And that's exactly what it did all those centuries ago. Eunuchs would bring their sacrificial animals with low-hanging heads to the site. Inhaling the toxic fumes was fatal, but there was a flaw in this conclusion. How did the priests survive? Scientists began measuring the CO2 concentration of the site and discovered that there was an obvious difference between night and day. With the sun burning overhead, the clouds of gas would quickly dissipate, but at night, they would form thick layers across the ground. The concentrations were so high that they would have no doubt claimed the lives of people in the evening, with the gas puffs running rampant through the arena. But during the day, the ominous clouds only coated the floor, still high enough to prevent the animals from escaping the suffocation, and the priests were simply too tall, allowing them to evade Pluto's breath. Number 1. It was the mid-1980s. Residents of Los Angeles, California were going about their lives. Although it was considered a safe place to be during that time, many would still go out at night, not knowing that something sinister was lurking in the shadows. An opportunist waiting for the right moment to attack. Their ages didn't matter. Their background and families were irrelevant. He just wanted to claim as many lives as possible. The residents had no idea how dangerous their routines were about to become. It all began on the 15th of January, 1984, when a police vehicle surrounded an abandoned gas station. It was here that the lifeless body of 21-year-old Sharon Dismuke was discovered. The brutality of her demise marked the start of an enduring mystery that would continue to haunt the California community for years to come. She had sustained blunt force trauma to the head, and 2 weeping wounds stained her chest. The weapon was a .25 caliber firearm. At first it seemed like just another narcotics-fueled homicide, but then more bodies began to turn up. Lying in a pool of vital fluid in a darkened alleyway near Westgate Avenue was 29-year-old Deborah Jackson. She too sustained wounds to the chest, 3 this time. Again, it seemed as though no one was around to witness it. They didn't know it at the time, but these 2 slayings were connected. A year after the body of Deborah was found, there was another. The red-stained alleyway of West Vernon Avenue was host to the brutal scenes. 35-year-old Henrietta Wright was found on a discarded mattress. Her body was littered with multiple wounds. From the first slaying in 1984, the same pattern would repeat itself until 2007. This was the work of the Grim Sleeper, a homicidal maniac who made Los Angeles the most dangerous city to be in during the 80s, well into the 2000s. For more than 20 years, this predator lurked in the back streets of Los Angeles, claiming lives from the shadows, operating at the height of a narcotics epidemic. And he seemingly got away with it before retreating underground for 13 years, before re-emerging to continue his dreadful ways. The Grim Sleeper, though, had something acting against him: breakthroughs in DNA technology. DNA evidence obtained from the bodies of the 2002 slayings linked them to the 1980s homicides. That trace evidence was saliva that had dried on the victims' bodies, allowing police to begin their search for the butcher who'd been terrorizing the community for years. But when they ran the samples through their database, they found no matches, and it seemed that the case was about to go cold once more. But investigators decided to turn to a controversial technique, which was to search for matching familial DNA markers in the database that indicated a relative to a possible suspect that was already in the system. And finally, there was a breakthrough. In 2009, a young man named Christopher was convicted of a felony weapons charge. His DNA matched in various ways to that obtained in the Grim Sleeper slayings, so much so that the police became convinced that he was a close relative. Soon, Christopher's father, Lonnie Franklin Jr., would emerge as the prime suspect. Beginning in 2010, undercover teams began to survey Franklin and his every move. On the 5th of July, they'd followed him to a birthday party in Orange County. A detective, disguised as a busboy, managed to grab a half-eaten pizza slice, a napkin, a fork, plastic cups, and a piece of chocolate cake, all of which held Franklin's DNA. The samples were quickly rushed to LAPD's DNA lab for testing and compared to that of the samples from the crime scenes. And just 2 days later, investigators arrived at the home of Lonnie Franklin Jr. and placed him in handcuffs. The 57-year-old was now in custody, and 6 years later, he'd be found guilty of 10 counts of first-degree homicide. After 2 years of wreaking havoc on Los Angeles and years of searching, waiting, and investigating, the Grim Sleeper mystery had finally been solved, and justice for his victims had finally arrived. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.